Alright, so this is probably going to be one of the longest videos just because there's so much to cover here in the 1960s. So, this is Objective 9, which deals with JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Vietnam. Gets us all the way, till about the mid-70s, I guess. Anyway, JFK was always known for his smile, and so one of the worst things that happened was the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, he did not stop it with a smile. It was stopped by someone else, and we'll cover that in class. Subject 9.1, we have the events of JFK, LBJ, and Nixon. And so let's cover this real quick. LBJ is not LeBron James, and as the guy says there, back in my day, LBJ was a president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so we will talk about him. First off is JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You can see there on the little picture, they call it the Kennedy mystique, something about them. People wanted to be them, and creating Camelot, which is what the White House was basically called during the Kennedy eras. Now, the election of 1960, the role of TV forever changes the way we elect presidents, because Nixon made the better points, but Kennedy looked better talking, and so we went with that. And nothing's really changed. So, again, the Kennedy mystique, he invited the press into the White House and basically brought them into the private life of the president. That's something that's never going to change. His domestic program is called the New Frontier, and famously in his inauguration, he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So this brings about a new active form of government. We'll talk about that. And then he also has the Peace Corps, which were an army of volunteers to help developing third world countries. All right. We have Kennedy's death on November 22nd, 1963. He's shot in Dallas, Texas. He's killed. They will arrest Lee Harvey Oswald, who is also killed by a man named Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission came out. It was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren Supreme Court. Published, and the thought was it was Oswald. The very famous film was called the Zapruder Film, and it sold to Oliver Stone, and the birth of many a conspiracy theory that comes out of that. We will look at some of those in class. It's kind of cool to look at. Anyway, with Kennedy gone, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, becomes president. And you can see here, this was the Johnson treatment. He liked to be very invasive and in people's faces and yell and put you into awkward situations. I don't know if he thought it was funny. Anyway. So the first thing is he's going to finish out JFK's term and pass some of his goals, including major civil rights legislation, etc. He will announce the Great Society, which is liberal programs that are akin or very similar to the New Deal of the 30s and 40s. Many of these new Great Society programs are still around today. Now, in the 1960s, the young kids, were inspired by the beats in the 1950s. We saw that in culture. They actually call it a counterculture, and they did completely everything opposite. The saying of the day was to turn on, tune in, and drop out. They rejected all their parental teachings. There was a saying, "Don't trust anyone over 30." They had a affinity for the drug LSD, which was created by LSD and popularized and brought into the mainstream. And out of this, the fashion and the music are lasting legacies today. One of the biggest fashion things they have are blue jeans, which prior to them wearing were mainly for work. Now, the counterculture groups, we will get more of these in class, but just some ones we have here. SDS, is Students for Democratic Society. Tom Hayden, their major in a sense there. We have Doves, generally counterculture word Doves, and that means they oppose Vietnam. We have the free speech movement. Mario Savio had a very famous speech where he likened people's bodies to cogs in a machine, and saying that you had to put your bodies on the machine and stop. And lastly, we have communal living, where everyone shares everything in common, and so this is socialism, communism. You can see why the government may be a little bit upset about this. There is a conservative backlash towards the end of the 60s. Actually starts in the 50s with a man named William Buckley. He had a conservative magazine during this time. Now, when Nixon is elected in 1968, he wins because of a silent majority. This is a nickname given to the older generation who were okay with what was going on in Vietnam, etc., didn't want to make many changes. He also won because he got the southern states to vote Republican, which they didn't do very often. The southern electoral votes in return for loose laws on integration. They really didn't want to integrate, even though they said they had to, and so we had that. Both of these will help get Richard Nixon elected in 1968. So let's talk about Nixon domestic. Now, Nixon domestic, you can see there he's trying to pass the bomb, if you will. We have the new federalism, which is part of Southern strategy, and they're going to turn some powers originally with the states to the states, such as deciding how to integrate, etc. There it is. He will also introduce revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is where the federal and the state put monies together to finance things such as interstate roads, hospitals, and also education, which we have today. Now, famously, Nixon gets in trouble for plumbers trying to fix the leaks at Watergate in 1968 towards 70. There's a document comes out called the Pentagon Papers. We'll look at a video after state test called The Post. And Daniel Ellsberg exposed that the government leaders were lying about Vietnam. They were saying, oh, we can win, and there was no way we could win. Nixon is paranoid during the re-election year. There's a group called CREEP, and it was campaigned to re-elect the president. They sent 4 plumbers, who were actually CIA agents, to fix a leak, in this case a news leak at the Watergate Hotel, and that was where the Democratic National Headquarters was. They get arrested, and this is the downfall. We'll look at a whole bunch of Watergate in class. And so, yes, it is that funny that Nixon knew about 4 plumbers creeping into Watergate to fix leaks. Now, Nixon will resign. Nixon used something that every president has used called executive privilege to not give up tape conversation in the White House. There's an event here called the Saturday Night Massacre in which 2 people quit and 1 is fired relating to Watergate. Ultimately, the United States Supreme Court will have to sue the president to receive the tapes. It's all about executive privilege. He has to surrender to the tapes. The smoking gun, which is the big evidence, did he know about Watergate, is on there. And so rather than doing this and impeachment hearings are coming on, Nixon is our only president to resign from the White House. Now, Nixon did do some positive things. While president, the biggest thing was his take on the Cold War. He had a policy called détente, which was an easing of tensions. The focus was nuclear reduction treaties. The major player was Henry Kissinger, his special assistant, who I always liken to the saying, kiss button, make up. And so Kissinger kissed a lot of butt. His plan was to use linkage, and he would find common themes, not divisions. One of the major themes he found was that China wanted to split away from the Soviet Union, and so he wanted to get close with China. And he found it through a very popular game. We'll talk about that later on. Now, Objective 9.2, we have the changing immigration policies and impact. And again, here's our friend with our lovely hair, Asian aliens, and because immigrants. It's just funny. Now, the Immigration Act of 1965 officially ended the quota system had been placed since the 1920s. And so you see on the map here how in 1900 immigration begins to go down, yet after 1960, 1970 more or less, you can see that it is actually rising very, very there. Now the big deal is to reunite the immigrant families at this point, and it's going to attract skilled immigrant labor to the United States. And so you think about skilled labor as people who are, let's say construction workers or doctors or just any other occupation you can think of. Now, the other big thing here is education. Many schools have the idea that we need to reach a greater number of students. So they're going to do this in the Bilingual Education Act. Programs that allow students to learn English when they're speaking a first language. The current version is called EL, and you can see right there, basic daily problems when you're bilingual and you forget words in both languages. I am bilingual, guys, and that does happen, and my goodness, it's horrible. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act is funding for schools in high poverty areas. Title I is the current version that we have. Head Start offered pre-K to students who couldn't afford it, so they'd have the same skills regardless of money. And lastly, Upward Bound is going to be programs to help poor minority students get to college. Now, Objective 9.3, other minority groups that are inspired by the civil rights movement of African Americans. And so you have, again, Native Americans, immigrants starting a way of life. Man, that must be tough. Again, it's kind of funny. Anyway, now the Native Americans, this is a picture of Alcatraz. We'll get there. They had a militant movement akin to the Black Panthers called AIM, the American Indian Movement. They wanted Indian land restored and their rights returned. Their leader was named Richard Oakes. And the most famous thing they did is they actually took, called it Occupied Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee. And today, my daughter and my wife last year went out to Alcatraz, and the sign you see on the right is still visible today where it says Welcome Indian Land. And they actually have some role in controlling tourism and going and seeing this very famous penitentiary, which the biggest thing was it was supposed to be unescapable, which people did escape, and also Al Capone spent some time there. Now, Hispanics, there's two movements with the Hispanics, and so the first one is Chicano movement. The leaders are Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Their goals are restoration of land and educational reform, mainly in inner cities, etc. Now, we also have the Migrant Farm Workers. The UFW is going to be a union organized by Cesar Chavez again. They're going to use something very similar to the Montgomery bus boycott called the Great Boroughs Boycott. They also use hunger strikes, which will attract the attention of Robert Kennedy, who is in part the Attorney General, and he is the one who's getting all these things to the attention of the president. And so you see here, don't buy grapes or lettuce in the UFW symbol. The farm workers need you now. The next one would be the disabled. Now, Kennedy actually passed mental health acts to recognize the need for the disabled. And the biggest thing is in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, signed by President Bush there, granted greater mobility for people with disabilities. And this is going to be the idea of handicap ramps and handicap parking and handicap stalls and all these things. Also along this time, we have the idea, get it? For the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, children with special educational needs need to learn in the least restrictive environment possible. And we see this in school today where there may be someone who maybe has problem hearing, and so they'll go through these different areas of what they have to get done. Now, Objective 9.4 is the feminist movement, all right? So we have two sexual revolutions in the United States. The first one is about suffrage, women's suffrage, which they will achieve that. And the second one is equal jobs and educational opportunities. Which to an extent, we've had some success here. However, this is the thing that's still being fought today. So there is a book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. She lays out goals for feminists such as equal pay, equal rights, and educational opportunities. Some gains, they do pass the Equal Pay Act, which says if you have the same amount of education, you should be paid the same amount. And also the Title IX Educational Act, which provides for female sports in high school and in college. And if you think about just all the different female sports and people that go to college, and there's an opportunity for that. My cousin was a volleyball player, and that's what got her through college. But nonetheless, there it is, okay? Now, the equal rights debate is actually going to cause a split in the movement. Some of the women believed that it was necessary. Other women thought that it would cause a problem, and we'll look at that debate. Now, a feminist is someone who believes that there should be equal rights for men and women. The Equal Rights Amendment, men and women would be 100% with no privileges to either gender. Gloria Steinem, who has Ms. Magazine, shows women in non-traditional roles and roles outside the home. And the whole idea here is to paint a different light on women can do other things rather than just be homemakers. which in the 1960s was a really, really bold statement, but today, not so uncommon. Now, the ERA does not pass because they did not get the number of states to ratify it. And so you can see right there, to date, 37 states have ratified the ERA. You actually need 38. It has to be done in a certain time. Now, the movement to stop the ERA was called Stop ERA. It was an acronym. It failed because of opposition from other women. Now, the younger generation actually wanted the Equal Pay Act, whereas the older generation did not, and they thought that was necessary to preserve the family and the heritage. Stop ERA. The stop stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. Women thought that, the older ones here believed that women would lose traditional privileges equal. So, for example, if there is ever a custody battle for children in a divorce hearing, most judges will not take children from their mother. And the father gets visitation rights, and very seldomly does that happen. If the ERA were to pass, the judge could not use that because that's a biased statement. However, based on the nature and nurture of mothers and all that thing, it is a stereotype and a bias that is used, and most everyone is okay with. Now, it's generally older women again. Key woman here, her name is Phyllis Schlafly. And this takes us to our newest thing, 2017 social media campaign called the #MeToo movement. This came about over Twitter, and the whole idea was to share stories in a comforting environment, maybe not put it out there in a public sense where it could threaten your job or anything like that, but share stories about sexual abuse, sexual harassment to raise awareness. It has spread into many different arenas, and it also has opposition. Most notably, there was one senator, the name escapes me right now, and he was accused of it and actually didn't do it, and it more or less hurt his career. So I would say, for the most part, this is a positive movement because these things do still occur. Now, Objective 9.5, we have environmental activism. Now, if we do not do something fairly quickly with our environment, we're going to end up like Fry here from Futurama when we go to the beach and we're not sure if it's jellyfish or it's plastic bag. And I will tell you, if that is the choices we have, that's a problem because plastic bags do not sting and hurt really, really badly. However, jellyfish do. So, in the 60s, 70s, we have the Clean Air and Water. Okay? And so the whole purpose of Clean Air and Water is so that we don't have SpongeBob, who lives in a dirty lake under the trash, who's living in a dirty lake under the trash. That's just funny to me. Not really, but we don't want that to happen, correct? So the Clean Air Act was designed to cut pollution in cities and factories by putting scrubbers. If you've ever seen things blowing white smoke, those are scrubbers. We also have the Clean Water Act. This is to ensure all Americans have access to clean water. And then the latest crisis we've had with the water was in Flint, Michigan, and they still really haven't got that solved. It had some things to do with the lead in the pipes. Now, we're also concerned highly about chemicals, in particular chemicals we're using to kill pests to grow crops. Rachel Carson actually produced a book called Silent Spring. She's a new kind of muckraker, and the whole idea was to stop the use of the pesticide DDT, and it has now recently been banned. And so that's a step in the right direction. Also, during the Vietnam War, there was a pesticide or deforestation agent called Agent Orange. This was designed to cut down the jungle brush, to find the enemy we couldn't find, but over the years it has led to a release of a substance known as dioxin that stays in the soil and the environment, and it actually has led to many cases of physical abnormalities in children, birth defects, and also death. And we'll look at a video about that in something called Remnants of War. But now, in this late 60s, early 70s, we're going to start the EPA, which the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. The goals, again, clean air, clean water. They want to reduce environmental risk, and they want to pass federal laws to protect the health of this. And so There's been a major push in this, and in fact, I believe it was President Obama who actually mandated that cars um, had to hit a certain specific mile per gallon or could not be sold, which that's a massively big deal. Now, in 1977, we have a incident here, a tragedy, I guess you could call it, the Love Canal. And so you see the little boy here, please help me, Love Canal recipe, mix 82 chemicals, place in canal for 25 years, sickness and death. So in 1977, there was a discovery of pollutants and chemicals in drinking water in the Love Canal area. The school was built on top of a toxic waste site, and children were getting very sick. And so the town is shut down, etc., and we're scrambling. We're trying to figure this out. Now, we also have some nuclear energy disasters, okay? So if we're going to move away from the industrialization thing and fossil fuels, we're going to go to nuclear. In 1979, 3 Mile Island near Pennsylvania has a partial meltdown. To date, you can't get anywhere near it. There was a show in the early 2000s called Viva La Bam, where Bam Margera actually did these kind of goofy little stupid pranks like ridiculousness or whatever. And in one of he tried to get near 3 Mile Island, and the Coast Guard sent out a Black Hawk attack helicopter and made him turn around. So, now the worst one in 1986 is Chernobyl. This is the worst nuclear plant disaster in the former Soviet Union. It's now in the Ukraine. It's the subject of actually an HBO series, which is very, very good. The Chernobyl diaries are not real. There's not like mutants or anything. There it is. Now, the most recent, in 2011, there was a nuclear meltdown that was caused by an earthquake and a tsunami in Fukushima, which is in Japan, and there's a lot of problems still today. So nuclear energy is used. It's used in submarines and other technology, but as far as using it for public sectors, it generally doesn't happen. Now, objective 9.6 is the growth of the suburbs and migration, and so we have gentrification. Gentrification is where you go into an area that's been run down and you try to make it appealing. Hence Macklemore showing up on Sesame Street and Oscar the Grouse's garbage can. More people would want to go to the garbage can if he were singing there or something of that nature. So we have the urban sprawl. Now, the problem with urban sprawl today is that we can't tell where the cities stop and the suburbs end. So you see here Dwight saying, "Oh, you're from Chicago." False. You're from the suburbs. Inner cities are not very well populated today. People live in the suburbs. It's like if you went somewhere and someone said, "Where are you from?" You're probably going to say, not South End, Mississippi, but rather you'd say Memphis because that's the biggest city. Now, in the 1950s, President Eisenhower is going to make the Interstate Highway Act. The whole purpose was to connect the country in case of a communist invasion. All right. We have a major migration pattern here where people leave the Rust Belt or the old industrial cities of the North to come to the Sun Belt, which is what you live in, for the jobs and land available. Suburbs are communities built near large cities so that workers can commute but avoid interstate problems such as crime and disease, etc. And urban sprawl when the suburbs have spread so much that it's difficult to tell where the city ends. Now we have inner city blues with the suburbs now in full effect. Living in the inner city is there's no jobs, there's no chance for jobs, and there's utter poverty. And this actually leads to gangs and drugs, which will ravage the cities in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. So there's an idea of gentrification where you improve an area to make it appealing to a middle-class person. And here in the picture you can see gentrification. You have the old kind of projects there, and it's bought by an investor, maybe someone from HGTV, and they go in and they make it a condominium. They charge a higher price. They maybe put a guard there, and families want to move back. The problem is those slums are where people who couldn't afford anything were living, and now we've put these people on the street, and where are they going to live? There's that. Now, in 9.7, we're going to talk about Cuba and Vietnam. And so one of the biggest things we had is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so you have the United States. What you got there? Cuba saying, a smoothie, but it's actually nukes or nuclear weapons. And so this was a big event. I don't think I can put it in perspective for you because a lot of people are just in the mindset. But the short story is we were 15 minutes away from basically never existing. And so that's a very scary concept. Now, Cuba in the 1960s, the USSR put nuclear missiles in Cuba. I'm getting a little nervous. It's uneasy. It makes this what it is. So after Fidel Castro takes over, we talked about him last time, the United States, the CIA, sold Kennedy on this idea of a Bay of Pigs invasion, where we would train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, and it failed miserably, and it actually drove Castro into a relationship with the Soviet Union. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a direct effect of that. The U.S. found these Soviet missiles in Cuba. They threatened nuclear war with the Soviet Union. We're in danger of MAD, which we had before. We're 15 minutes away from stopping to exist as a world. Scary thought. And so we'll discuss that and what happened there. Now we get into our next proxy war here, and that's Vietnam. And so let's talk about the early involvement of Vietnam. So first off, we actually went because the President Eisenhower had a theory called the domino theory. And there it is next to you. The idea is to stop communism in Southeast Asia. And so we were actually paying French debt to fight the communists in Vietnam and lose. Now, in 1954, the French are defeated at the Battle of Bien Dinh Pho, and we are actually going to take over at that point. In 1954, they sit at the table, and Vietnam is divided like Korea at the 17th parallel. The North Vietnam was communist, Ho Chi Minh, and it is kind of Soviet-backed at that point. South Vietnam, they are democratic, and Ngo Dinh Diem is the president, and it is U.S.-backed, and so that's where we're at this point. Now, the escalation of Vietnam happens, okay? So in South Vietnam, there was a group of supporters called the Viet Cong who did not like the idea of democracy, and they wanted to have a whole country. So in 1963, there's a military coup. They kill Ngo Dinh Diem, his wife, his kids, etc., in South Vietnam. They stop the coup. The United States come in and they help. But in 1964, there's an incident, the Gulf of Tonkin. You see it here in the U.S. ships on August 4th, 1964. If they're asked, they're fired upon. Yes, but actually no. And there's a little stuff here, and we'll talk about it in class right here. I'm giving you the short version, okay? So 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, after this, gave President Johnson war powers to escalate the war. This is a major problem because this should never happen. Congress declares war. If you're putting war powers in the hands of one man, and I'm saying man at this point because we have yet to have a female president, that's a really big, scary issue. Now, to supply this, Viet Cong, there was a trail called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's a secret system of tunnels to supply the Viet Cong, or as we called them, Charlie, in their war against the United States. Now, Vietnam continues to brew, and we have all these people going, but 1968 is major. We call it the year of coming apart, and you can see everything that's happening there. I didn't list it there, but also Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy are assassinated in this year. There's violence in Chicago over Vietnam. There's the My Lai massacre, of which the picture there is kind of a representative. We have the Tet Offensive, which showed the public that we could not win Vietnam. So even though the president's saying victory's at hand, we're not winning. And then also we have the Pentagon Papers proving the previous presidents had misled about Vietnam. Now in the 1970s, Nixon wins by promising to get out of Vietnam. However, he actually expands the war into Cambodia. They fall to the Khmer Rouge, which is another communist group, the Cambodians do, and one of the worst military dictators we've had in a long, long time, Pol Pot. There's also the Kent State protest and massacre here in the United States. Now, the end of the war, we have the new weapons of napalm and Agent Orange. We have Vietnamization, which is Nixon's plan to turn the fighting over to South Vietnam. Kissinger is going to play a role. He's a special assistant that negotiated at the end. We have the holiday bombings, in which Nixon will invade Cambodia to cut off supply lines. It's been made into a song, which I cannot play for you because I like my job. And Saigon falls immediately after the U.S. leave, and it is now known as Ho Chi Minh City. So I know that was a lot there, guys, but all very important stuff for you.